The Lord be with you. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Loving and holy God, as we come together around these tables and in this place today, we thank you for this time, for the gift of ministry that we have here at St. Peter's and for this church on this All Saints Sunday as we hold up to you the lives of those who have gone before us. We ask you that you would help fill us with a sense of their presence in our lives and continue to inspire us with their witness and with their legacy. Thank you for this time that we have to be together, for the food that is being eaten, and we ask that it would nourish our bodies and us always to your service. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Please, as you know, continue eating. We were a little bit on this feast day. We had a little bit more to do in church today. So I know that you didn't get started with breakfast until just a few minutes ago. So obviously, please continue to eat. This is the last in a 4-part series, but if you haven't been here for any of the other 3, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying that to set some context. This is the last in a 4-part series that has focused on several different things that have ancient connotations that we find in Holy Scripture, that have been part of life and of the church and of Judaism since the beginning of time. And today we're going to talk about miracles. We've looked at blessings, we've talked about forgiveness, and we've also talked about prayer. So today I want to end this with by talking about and hopefully us having some conversation about miracles. But before I do that, I just want to tee up what's going to happen over the next several weeks. As most of you, or maybe all of you know, it's the custom here at St. Peter's to set up a giving tree, a physical tree that goes up out in the narthex. That will be set up beginning next Sunday, and part of that is an opportunity that we have then through that symbolic tree to give in support of organizations and ministries here in our community. And so this year we're going to, and I may need Jacqueline's help. We're going to help support 4 different ministries. One is the Haven of Grace. One is a ministry called Oasis International, which is working to help provide support for refugees. The third is ECM, Episcopal City Mission, that most of you are familiar with. It works with juvenile delinquents who are incarcerated or in the criminal justice system. And the fourth is Trinity Food Ministry. And actually today, our members of our church are cooking for Trinity and will be down there serving a hot meal. And then some of you may have brought back bags of groceries with groceries in them that you took away from last Sunday. So in this forum for the next 4 Sundays, beginning next Sunday, we're going to have people from those 4 different organizations who will be here to talk about the ministry that they are a part of or that they are leading, and then to help us have a little bit deeper understanding of some of the needs and concerns that are all around us and that are out there that they're helping and working to address. So I hope that you'll come and be part of that. And again, I don't remember the exact schedule, but each of those different ministries and organizations will be represented over the next 4 Sundays. So today, I want us to talk a little bit and have some conversation about miracles. I want to begin with just providing a few definitions of what a miracle is, at least as it has been defined by some. Craig Keener is a Bible, a New Testament scholar that you're going to see and hear from in just a moment is making part of a presentation that he made. But he has written pretty extensively on miracles, and he just defines a miracle as being just pretty basic, a special divine action. And so let's hear a little bit more about some of what he has to say about miracles.
My observation is that not exclusively, by any means, God can do anything anywhere, but not exclusively, but most often, these dramatic signs happen especially in areas of groundbreaking evangelism, in relatively new areas for the gospel. Now, again, James chapter 5, prayer for the sick. God can heal us all sorts of ways. He can work through medicine, it's still an answer to prayer. He can heal us gradually, it's still an answer to prayer. But usually things like raising the dead and so on, not exclusively, again, I'll give you some other examples of it where it wasn't in groundbreaking areas. But most often, that happens in areas where God is really working to get people's attention in groundbreaking evangelism. But this is not a new...
And I'll say a little bit more about those comments that he makes. In what's called the glossary of terms which is a variety of terms that we use in our tradition, the Episcopal Church. This comes from the dictionary of the Episcopal Church that defines a miracle as being something that happens, an event in time that's perceived by the senses of those who witness it. Miracles reflect the direct activity of God which transcends the usual order of nature for a religious purpose. And then, Jacqueline, can we turn down this part of the lights a little bit? N.T. Wright, who some of you are familiar with and some of you have heard me reference before, who's recognized as being one of the preeminent New Testament scholars in our tradition, and who is a bishop in the Church of England. Talks about miracles in our culture as usually indicates a God who is outside the processes of the world, but who reaches in for a moment and does something bizarre and then goes away again. Which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. Is this God who we look at being out there somewhere, that trend, what we call the transcendent God, as opposed to the God who's right with us, who then kind of dips into the ins and the outs and the stuff of our lives and of our world, and then who transcends that for some other purpose. All right. You're making this challenging for me this morning, aren't you? Sorry. And then Philip Yancey, who is also someone who's a very prolific author about a number of topics in Christianity, has written pretty extensively about miracles. And he talks about how miracles have played this interesting and kind of what he calls a strange role throughout the history of faith. Not just in Christianity, but going back again to the earliest days of Judaism and to the point of creation. And at times providing this strong reason for belief, and then at times, as he points out, a strong reason for disbelief. So again, this tension between miracles that support what we believe, and then miracles that push us to a point where it just seems like that makes us really question what it is we believe, have some sense of doubt. And so the question then that I want to kind of make as the overarching one is, if God can and does work through miracles in these mysterious ways, in the holiness and in the depth of mystery, why doesn't God do so for everybody? For you, for me, and not only for you and for me, but why doesn't God do that all the time? Okay? St. Augustine, one of the early, what we refer to as being one of the early fathers of the church, says that miracles are not something that are contrary to nature, but only contrary to what we know. To our limited knowledge about what it is that God has what God has created and what God has put into place. That they're not contrary, but that they are only contrary to us. So again, once again, we're limited in our understanding of the depth and of the breadth of God, and that keeps us, as he points out, from sometimes being able to see and understand more clearly what a miracle really is. There's been a fair amount of research and writing about how at other points in time, miracles seem to be more widely accepted, more widely affirmed, more widely looked upon as just being the way that God was at work in people's lives and through people, not necessarily just through Jesus, but through other people, but that we are among one of the first generations in history to be skeptical about that. And to have difficulty affirming that, that miracles actually do continue to take place, and that they're not something that just were part of what, oh, well, that was something that happened a long time ago, but you know, that's what Jesus did. But those don't happen anymore. So why is it that we're so skeptical? What is it that causes us to be to question that? One of the things that many come back to is something that was written by the Scottish philosopher David Hume, that some of you may be familiar with, who talks about and writes about, and in his opinion, that miracles are actually violations of natural law, and that because of that, natural law isn't something natural law is, he sees natural law as something that can't be violated. If God has put into place this order, these things that happen from creation and through the ongoing act of creation and of life and of death and resurrection, that miracles are a violation of that, and so natural law is something that can't be violated. And his definition then it takes miracles then completely out of existence. Okay? He goes on then to support his arguments by saying that no miracle has been attested by a sufficient number of educated and rational witnesses. Okay? So in essence, anyone who's ever said, well, that was a miracle, or I've been part of a miracle, or something happened in miraculous, is not someone who is educated or rational. I don't know about that. He also then goes on to say that it's our tendency, we have a human tendency, by nature, we want to believe in the spectacular. And so we look at something and say, oh, well, that must be a miracle, because it's so spectacular. The only way we can define that is because it's a miracle. Most reports, he said, of miracles occur among ignorant and barbarous people. And then claims of miracles occur in all religious traditions, which means that everything's just canceled out. So if we hold up and try to say, okay, well, Jesus healed the sick, Jesus walked on water, Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus was born human and divine, then okay, whatever, because there are other things like that in other religious traditions, and so that all just cancels out. So that's part of why, and is one of the chief arguments made for why we, in our generation and this time, tend to be more skeptical because of his influence and of the way that has been used and then incorporated into other teaching, into other philosophies and other theologies. So back to Craig Keener, who points out that in the Bible, it's clear that God acts in special or extraordinary ways in history and people's lives to reveal God and to get people's attention. So we see that over and over again. You notice he doesn't just say that Jesus did this, but he says in the Bible. We see how God does extraordinary things and works in extraordinary ways, not only to continue the process of helping people to understand and to know more about who God is. And if you point, in our tradition, you would point directly to the revelation of God through what? Oh, please, somebody say this, or we're going to have to start from scratch. The revelation of God to us as Christians is directly through? Oh, thank you. Okay. So what he would say is that there's the extraordinary and for us is Jesus. And you're going to see this again in a moment through something C.S. Lewis talks about, is that the most significant miracle is the birth of Jesus, the incarnation. Okay? Again, some of you are familiar with, or maybe familiar with Walter Brueggemann, who would be the equivalent actually was before N.T. Wright, I think, probably in terms of age, but is the Old Testament equivalent of N.T. Wright in terms of his scholarship and the things that he's written and studied about the Old Testament. And he talks about how we tend to think of a world today without miracles. And that we look at that as just being the way that it is. And that miracles are seen to be problematic. But as he points out, and he's in this ancient text, which he's referring to as the Bible, the wonders of faith that impinge upon life are taken as treasured first-hand evidence of the power of God, and are treated as normal for a world open to reality beyond human management. So as he points out, there is something going on that we can see, and that's the gift to us of the ancient text of the Scriptures that helps point to how it is that God is at work in the world and in our lives, impinging upon life, and to help show the power of God. If you go back to the Hebrew Scriptures, we see the things that happen. Moses in a bush that burned, unexplainably and inexplicably burning, and Moses through that was able to somehow and in some way experience God. We know about how we read the story about how the waters parted so that the people of Israel could get out and be freed, and then they closed back in to allow them to be able to move on. So over and over again, we see these stories from the very beginning of the Bible until the very end of how God is working and is doing these wonderful and remarkable things to help emphasize and to help focus on who God is and on the power and presence of God. Walter Brueggemann goes on to say that the narrative part of the Hebrew Bible attests to these variety of wonders and these different ways in which God is at work. And these acts of God's power breaking in upon business as usual in ways that generate new possibility of life. Now, think about, and let's just talk for a minute about, just throw out some of the things that you remember about what Jesus did, miraculous things that Jesus did. Healed people. Do you remember a specific instance of that? The lady, someone comes up to him, touches his garment. He's in a crowd of people, has no idea who it is, and says, "Who touched me?" And by touching him, she was healed. What else?
Water into wine.
Turning water into wine. Yes. The healing of the blind man, Bartimaeus, sitting on the side of the road, who's screaming at Jesus. Everybody's telling him to shut up. He won't do it. And Jesus says, well, tell him to come to me. He comes. He's healed. Lazarus. The healing of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Brother of Mary and Martha, good friends of Jesus. Jesus hung out there a lot in Bethany. Gets word that Lazarus is sick. Says, okay, I'll go in a little while. Shows up, Lazarus is already dead. Goes to the tomb. Cries, gets emotional, and then raises Lazarus. So over and over again, we see how the power of God breaking into what would be considered to be the ordinariness of life. The woman who reached out to touch Jesus. Do you remember what was significant about her? She had been bleeding for a long time. I don't know, like 17 years? I don't remember the number, but a long time.
I found this on the web.
Well, thank you. And then you have the various other ways in which we see and know that there were these extraordinary things, or just the ordinariness of life that was then made extraordinary by what Jesus was able to do. So Anne mentioned the turning of water into wine. In John's gospel, in the Gospels, that's the first recorded miracle of Jesus. Some of you in here will remember The Tonight Show when Johnny Carson was the host. So there's this story told about this little 8-year-old boy who was a guest of Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show, and he had been somehow involved in. He was from West Virginia. He'd somehow been involved in helping to rescue some coal miners, and I don't know that part of it. So he's sitting there on the couch next to Johnny Carson, and Johnny Carson starts talking to him, and somehow it comes out that he's a Christian, that this little boy goes to church and he was a Christian. So Johnny Carson asked him, said, "Well, what do you learn? What have you learned about? Tell us something you've learned about in Sunday school." And so he says, "Well, I've learned about how Jesus turned water into wine." And Johnny Carson says, "Okay, well, what did you learn about that? What did that mean to you?" And he starts squirming like a little 8-year-old does. And finally, he looks back up at Johnny Carson and says, "Well, if you're going to have a wedding, you better invite Jesus." So Brueggemann goes on to point out that those of us who have been able to be the readers of the ancient text, what he refers to as the community of readers, we continue to remember, we continue to recall, we continue to celebrate, and to be dazzled by such wonders as evidence that the world, for all of its failures, for all of its sin, all of its evil, is open to something new, to new life, to new possibility. Now, this is very, very Christian. Brueggemann is a Christian, but this is also very Eucharistic in its orientation, because every time we come together, which some of you have already done this morning, some of you will do in a few minutes, we remember, we recall, we celebrate. In the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, we are remembering and we're recalling what Jesus did and said right before another one of the great miracles of his resurrection, when he was with his disciples, and he said, "Every time you do this after I'm gone, remember me." Okay? Think about me. Do this together, which is why we continue to do this, right? So we're remembering, we're recalling, we're celebrating, and hopefully, and this is probably a little bit, we probably give this less attention, but to be dazzled by what we're experiencing over and over again. All right, I want you to hear a little bit from N.T. Wright, who talks about, who's also going to say a few things about miracles.
When people look at the dramatic things that Jesus is said to have done in the Bible, often in our world they come with a kind of a split-level universe where things are either natural or supernatural. And in the world of the Bible, it's not quite like that. I noticed that in the Psalms, it says that God feeds the young ravens when they call upon him. Now, is that a supernatural act, or is that what we would call just nature and instinct? How God feeds the young ravens is that they squawk and the mummy bird brings food for them. And the Bible says God's in that, God's involved with that, so that we don't have a God who is normally outside the process and occasionally reaching in and doing things, and then we say, wow, that's supernatural. God does lots of extraordinary things all the time, and some of the extraordinary things are just so bizarre that people say this is very, very special, like the magicians of Egypt say, this is the finger of God, and make no mistake. But in the New Testament, we don't have a single word for miracle. We have words like paradox, words like deeds of power, and so on. People were saying, this is extraordinary, this doesn't normally happen. And this doesn't mean that they were plugging into what we mean by supernatural, where you have this split-level universe. It means that they who believed that God was always present and active were discovering that some of the time where Jesus was, God was doing extra special, extraordinary things. Now, of course, they believed that all sorts of people had healing powers. They believed that the prophets had been healers. Elijah and Elisha were healers. That didn't mean that they were the incarnate Son of God. Christians have often said, because Jesus did these miracles, therefore he's the incarnate second person of the Trinity. You better be careful, or you'll make Elijah and Elisha the second person of the Trinity as well. And that really wouldn't help. Likewise, people have said, well, Jesus could predict the future because he was the incarnate Son of God. Well, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they predicted the future because they were inspired prophets. So we have to be careful not to short-circuit the argument. Having said all of that, it's one of the remarkable gains of contemporary history on Jesus that a majority of current Jesus scholars, including many who are not Christian believers, agree that Jesus did do remarkable healings, and that that is the main explanation for why he attracted crowds and drew so many followers. It wasn't just that his teaching was exciting, though it was. They came because things were happening. You know, a great aunt who had been sick for 50 years.
All right, so that was a good bit, but what I wanted you to be able to hear was that there's not a separation between that which you might view as supernatural and the reality of how God is at work in your life and in my life and in the life of the world. So, as we know, and as we've already pointed out, the New Testament is actually filled with various accounts of the way in which Jesus performed miracles. Healing miracles, miracles that involve nature, in which he exercised power over nature, miracles in which he exorcised demons, and occasions in which a miracle illustrates something, pointed to something that he was trying to make a point about. So I mentioned Philip Yancey earlier. Philip Yancey, again, has done a lot of writing and research on miracles, and he summarizes what he has found and what his opinions about miracles are with about 10 different statements. The first is that he says that the Gospels record about 36 different incidents of miracles. The second is that Jesus resisted miracles on demand. Okay, Jesus didn't didn't respond to someone saying, "I want you to perform a miracle." In fact, I'm not sure that he says this, but you may there's a point where someone asks, "Show us some signs, prove to us who you are," and Jesus admonished them very, very strongly. So, even when he was presented with opportunities to do so, he did not perform miracles on demand. And in fact, he often then would hush people up. And say, don't tell anyone. Mark's gospel is pretty good about helping us to see how Jesus would heal somebody and then say, no, basically, just be quiet. Just go your way. In the gospel accounts, spectacular miracles, and I think this one's interesting. Spectacular miracles usually create distance, not intimacy. Create distance and not intimacy. So it's not as if Jesus was using miracles to try to draw his apostles, the 12 who were the closest to him, or others who were following him closer. But in fact, what he did often then seemed to place a little more distance between him and them. People in Jesus' day found it no easier to believe in miracles than we. Okay? So so to make the argument, oh well, that was what happened then, they were more receptive to that, is not, Yancey says, accurate. Most miracles of healing came about not because Jesus was trying to make a point, not because he was trying to, as N.T. Wright talked about, show that he was the Son of God, but because of Jesus' compassion. And there are places where we hear where it says, and Jesus had compassion on him or on her, and then Jesus touched and healed. Spiritual miracles tended to excite Jesus more than physical ones. Most often what we see with the physical miracles are Jesus saying, just, okay, you're healed. Now your faith has made you well, go. But it was the spiritual miracles that tended to excite him more. Jesus' miracles were a sign of how the world should be and someday ultimately will be. And Jesus did no miracles for the purposes of self-promotion, of trying to raise funds, to try to support what he was doing, his ministry. That was not part of what he did. He also performed miracles to establish his credentials so that when he declared who he was, he would have some evidence to back up that claim. So those are just a few of the things that Philip Yancey has come up with, again, in his research and his writing and his study of miracles. And then N.T. Wright goes on to say that God is always at work within this battered but still beautiful world acting in unexpected ways. So again, it's not as if what happened and what we read about and what we hear preached about is something that was just a thing of the past or of the ancient world, but that God, who brought all of life into being, human life, natural life, everything, is still acting and working in unexpected ways. And as also as N.T. Wright pointed out, there are a few serious historians, Bible scholars who deny that Jesus, and for that matter many other people, performed miracles. Miracles of healing and did other startling and remarkable things for which there was no natural reaction. So I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Miracles. And he talks about that the Christian story is precisely the story of what he refers to as the grand miracle. And as he points out, that begins with the birth of Jesus. That the incarnation of Jesus, not necessarily his death, his resurrection, or his ascension, but that it's his incarnation, his birth, that is the story that begins the story of what he refers to as being his grand miracle. He points out that one is often very asked whether we could not have a Christianity stripped, or as people who ask it say freed from its miraculous elements. A Christianity with the miraculous elements suppressed. Now it seems to me, he says, that precisely the one religion in the world, or at least the only one I know of, with which you could not do that is Christianity. That if you take away all the elements of miracle, if you take away all that Jesus did and the healing miracles, the other miracles, then that, as C.S. Lewis says, would strip our faith bare. Okay, I'd like to hear from you, from those of you and those of all of us who are skeptical about miracles. What do you have to say? How have you been skeptical? How might have you experienced a miracle or looked at miracles or a miracle in your life or in the life of others? Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question. When you were talking about spiritual miracles, there's always the physical, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Is there something that is just
Well, you think about, say, Jesus walking on water. Jesus being in the boat with the disciples, and the big storm comes up, and he's sleeping, and they're saying, do you not care about us? We're going to drown. And then he calms the wind and the waves. Yeah.
Well, David, are there modern day miracles? Or are they all disclaimed because of science or philosophers or knowledge that we've gotten so far beyond the people who are asking about miracles?
I'd like to hear what you think, and then I'll tell you my opinion.
Well, I think of many things but they wouldn't be called miracles. Like, I think going to Mars, I think that's an absolute miracle. I saw the reflection of the light coming in from up at the altar today. I wouldn't call that miracles. They're startling, they're amazing. There's a reason for it happening because of how far we've gotten in science and how far we've gotten with our knowledge. But I don't know if there are. We don't certainly, we're not, if we walk in water, they say it's ice, there's always a reason for it.
Yeah. Well, and if you remember, one of the things that was said is that the ancients, those who would have been there during the time of Jesus and when others after Jesus. And remember, it wasn't just Jesus who performed miracles. There were others and other faith healers and others who were able to perform acts of curing and healing. And then Jesus is the apostles. Jesus empowered them to go in His name and to do things after his resurrection and then ascension. And we hear how they did go out and perform miracles. But I would go back in response to what you're saying, Mary, to part of what C.S. Lewis talks about with how it's the incarnation, it's the birth of Jesus that points to the most significant miracle and point to the miracle that we've all experienced because we're here today, is the miracle of life. You know? And every time that there is another life that is given, that within itself is a miracle. And then you think about how many times, and we've got at least one doc in here, maybe I'm missing more, but to know that there, I think if he doesn't agree with me, I'm sure he'll let me know. I think Brig would agree with me to say that sometimes there are things that happen that are unexplainable. Is that fair, Brig? Absolutely. Yeah. That even those who are the most well-trained, the most competent, the most skillful physicians, if you're talking about just miracles of healing and how people are cured, there are some things that happen for which we do not know, we do not understand. So I think that we also, if you remember what I was saying, is that we've been identified as being skeptical because of some of what I pointed out with this philosopher David Hume. But apparently there's always been skepticism. There's always been questions and concerns about, you know, how could that happen? Because it goes against everything that we think that we can understand or identify with.
I also am in healthcare, that's my profession, and I don't know whether Brig would agree with me, but the miracles that I experienced with that, the people always had the greatest faith that these miracles seemed to happen too. And also I believe very strongly that miracles don't just happen right now, that they can be down the road, that one day we'll understand, or you or I will understand.
Yeah, yes. And I think, you know, part of what I come away from thinking about this with is that we're the ones who get in the way of being able to answer that question. Because, you know, we pride ourselves on being, you know, whatever you want to call it. You know, educated, knowledgeable, rational, you know, whatever people. And so how could that happen? That's just not possible. So what are we doing? There was a someone at one point who talked about how we tend to put God in a box. And most often the box that we put God in is the box that we're comfortable in. And if I get too much outside, if I let God outside the box, then oh wow, there may be some things that I really have to admit happen that's God and not me. Other thoughts about miracles?
Well, you see geniuses and you see savants and things like that, and some of that you think is a miracle because it's beyond the norm. I mean, it's beyond what we comprehend. And,
right.
But you know, this kid that can write music at 3 years old or something like that. I mean, I'd call that a miracle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And absolutely. And then, you know, as been pointed out about Jesus, things that Jesus did, the spiritual miracles, and specifically if you look at the you know the calming of the storm, were things that were part of the natural order that were going to come to an end, right? I mean, the storm would have ended, but Jesus, as the incarnate Son of God, we're told, was able to expedite that, you know, to make that happen in a way that helped to point to God and point to the power and the wonder and the way in which God was at work to preserve life in that particular instance. Somebody, yes, Troy.
People suffering from alcoholism and drug addiction come into Alcoholics Anonymous, and their first step is to admit that they are powerless over alcohol and that their lives have become unmanageable. And then they ask God to remove their compulsion to drink. And it's God that heals them and helps them overcome their addictions. And when you look through history, Alcoholics Anonymous came about in, I think, the late 40s. Up until that time, the best efforts of science and you name it were used to try to cure people who were alcoholics, and nothing ever worked until this spiritual program came along based on the Oxford movement I just think those are miracles. People who
Yeah.
ask God to remove compulsion, and it's removed, and then they go on to live normal lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing.
Yeah. You know, and I would offer too that I think some of what has jaded us in this time in which we live has been those who have abused that notion that God works miraculously. I mean, we've all seen in some way those who in many cases have lost all credibility, have lost everything. The ones who will, on television will put their hands on somebody and, and weird things start happening, and then, Mary just goes away and we're told, well, she was miraculously healed. Well, what we learned is that in many cases that was all staged. That didn't happen. That was all an attempt to do exactly what we heard Philip Yancey say that Jesus was not trying to do. That was all designed to raise money, to draw attention to a certain ministry or to a certain person. And again, biblically, we know that that's not what Jesus was trying to do. We know that's not why God performed miracles. But in those cases, I tend to, as I can speak for myself, we tend to go, well, yeah, if that's what a miracle is, then they certainly can't exist, right? Because those people have. So I think that's part of what we've been able to see, that type of abuse of the power of God, which we know is not how God works. That's not how God performs miracles. Other thoughts?
David?
Yes.
My cousin sent us a book, and just to bring it down a little bit lower, but just to show God's involvement in our lives. When God is at work all the time, and we maybe miss it, we don't see it, but every once in a while something we think sort of miraculously happens. And this book calls it a God wink.
A God what?
A God wink.
Wink. Mm-hmm.
God's winking at us.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not necessarily some major thing, but just a little bit of evidence of God at work in our everyday lives as we go about doing whatever we're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, don't you? I think the hardest part of about that is being open and available and willing to recognize and see that wink, isn't it? Because we get so caught up in our own stuff and in whatever that stuff may be, and we're distracted and we're pulled away by so many things. And I think what we hear over and over again is that no, God is actually still working. God is actually still trying to be revealed to us in ways that we're not always aware of. Sometimes little ways, but then even sometimes the bigger ways that we don't give credit to God for. We got God in the box,
My organization daily hands out scriptures, and they've handed them out to people who are truly adjudged to be evil, who then ended up forming a church. Is that a miracle? Of course.
Of course. Sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think there's something to be said for God's timing in our life as well, and the way in which God can intercede in a moment. When my parents got divorced, my mom had to go on like a whole new insurance plan, and because she was on my dad's, and the previous insurance plan was doing a mammogram every 2 years, and this new one wanted one every year. And with this new one, they found stage 2. And so it was the way in which the divorce played into the insurance, into the mammogram, into like saving my mom's life. Mm-hmm. And the way in which like God's timing allowed all those things to happen is one of the biggest miracles of my life.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Rich?
Anybody who knows me knows that I'm the most skeptical person in the whole world. But on the other hand, I think that there are miracles happening all the time that we don't see, we don't comprehend. And I think one of the biggest ones is that the world is not in as big a mess as it could be, because human beings, by their nature, are really rather brutish. Mm-hmm. But one of the miracles may be that some of us aren't. And there may be multiple reasons why that is, but I think that's a miracle. And that by reason of that, we restrain some of the other people who would otherwise be running amok. And that, we may have, a few more years ahead of us, as a planet that lives reasonably okay together. I think that's the biggest miracle that I can think of. And you can call it a God wink, or you can call it something grander than that, but I think that's the biggest miracle.
Great. Thank you.
This film ended up on a positive note, that things are going to be better. I don't remember exactly what it was said, that things are getting better. Well, how do we see that in the messes we've created right now?
Well, I mean, I think there's, if you look back historically, there's always been messes. The messes that we know about are the ones that we live in some ways that we maybe have contributed to. But I think that the hope and ultimately is the hope for us is the hope of the resurrection, and the hope that we see over and over again in how God was and is at work in the world, trying to be revealed to us through these miraculous ways, whether we define it that way or not. So that's my take from that. Okay, I would love to continue having this conversation, but there's going to have to be a miracle of a priest if I don't show up for the next service. Would you all just join me before we stop in recognizing, helping me welcome Zach Rugenstone. He's our new youth minister. Thank you all for being part of this. God bless you.